Will you marry me?
Time to sink this! What are you doing? The bridge! Stop!
In a quiet riverside town where the days moved slowly like the gentle current of the water, life was simple and familiar. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, their families, and even the stories of their childhood. Every morning the air carried the smell of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and the soft chatter of neighbors greeting one another. If a stranger entered the town, it would not take long before every ear had heard about it. But long before any stranger came, the town had its own stories whispered under mango trees, told beside evening fires, and remembered whenever the wind blew softly over the river. One of those stories began at the old bridge that stretched across the deep river at the edge of the town. The bridge was old, built many years ago by hands that were now long gone. Its wooden rails were worn smooth by time, and every plank carried the footsteps of generations. Lovers had stood there holding hands, children had leaned over it to watch fish swimming beneath the water, and elders often sat nearby telling stories of the past. The river below was wide and deep, moving quietly most days. But the older people in town often warned the young ones, never joke with this river. It looks calm, but it hides many secrets. Not far from that bridge, right at the center of the town square, stood a small cozy cafe. It was not a fancy place like the big restaurants in the city, but people loved it more than any grand building. The walls were painted a warm yellow, the windows were always open to let in the morning breeze, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the air long before sunrise. Farmers came there before heading to their fields, traders stopped by for a quick cup of coffee, and travelers passing through town often rested there before continuing their journey. But what truly made the cafe special was not just the bread or the coffee. It was the two young women who ran it. Their names were Amara and Lydia, and in that town everyone knew their story. They had grown up together like two seedlings planted side by side in the same soil. From the time they were little girls running barefoot through dusty paths, they had shared everything: food, secrets, laughter, and even tears. If you saw Amara walking down the road, you could almost be sure Lydia would appear behind her moments later. The two of them were like shadows that never separated. Amara was known by everyone in the town as the girl with the gentle heart. She had a calm voice and kind eyes that made people feel at peace whenever they spoke to her. She worked harder than most people her age, waking up before the first rooster crowed to start baking bread for the cafe. No matter how tired she was, she always welcomed customers with a warm smile. Old Mama Said, who came every morning with her walking stick, often said, "That girl Amara, her heart is softer than fresh butter," and truly, it was hard to find anyone in the town who did not love her. She listened to people when they spoke, helped neighbors when they needed help, and never spoke harshly to anyone. If a poor traveler came to the cafe without enough money, Amara would quietly slide a piece of bread across the table and whisper, "Eat first, you can worry about the money later." Lydia, on the other hand, was different. Though she loved her friend deeply, at least that was what everyone believed, Lydia was beautiful in a striking way, with bright eyes that always seemed to be searching for something beyond the town. She was confident, charming, and knew how to speak in a way that made people laugh when customers entered the cafe. Lydia often entertained them with lively stories while Amara worked behind the counter, but inside, Lydia's heart was a restless dream that no one in the town truly understood. Sometimes in the quiet evenings after closing the cafe, Lydia would lean against the window and stare toward the long road that led out of town. "Amara," she would say softly, "do you ever think about leaving this place?" Amara would look up from wiping the tables and smile. Gently. "Leaving? Why would I want to leave? Everything I need is here. Lydia would shake her head slowly, a faint sigh escaping her lips. You are too simple, my friend. The world is bigger than this small town. There are cities where lights shine all night, where people wear beautiful clothes and live in houses bigger than the town hall. Amara would laugh quietly and reply, big houses do not always bring big happiness. Lydia would smile back, but deep inside her heart she disagreed. While Amara was content with the simple life of the town, Lydia often felt as though she had been born for something greater. She dreamed of wealth, of luxury, of leaving behind the dusty roads and wooden houses of the place she had known all her life. Yet despite their differences, the two young women remained inseparable. They worked together, laughed together, and shared their dreams under the same roof of that little cafe. People in the town admired their friendship so much that they often spoke about it as if it were something sacred. Those two girls, the elders would say, nodding wisely. They are not just friends, they are sisters who chose each other. And whenever those words were spoken, Amara would smile with quiet pride while Lydia would nod in agreement. But sometimes, late at night when the town had fallen silent and the river whispered softly beneath the old bridge, Lydia would lie awake staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with thoughts she never spoke aloud, thoughts about the life she believed she deserved, a life far away from that quiet town, and though no one in the town knew it yet, those silent dreams sleeping inside Lydia's heart would one day grow into something far darker than anyone could imagine. One bright afternoon, when the sun sat high above the town and the dust road shimmered with heat, something unusual happened. A long black car rolled slowly into the town from the highway road. It was the kind of car people in that small riverside town had only seen in movies or on the rare television at the barber's shop. The car was polished so brightly that the sunlight danced on its surface like water. As it moved slowly past the market stalls, people began to stop whatever they were doing. A trader who was arranging tomatoes on her wooden table straightened up and whispered to the woman beside her, "Ah, who is that coming with such a car?" A group of children who were chasing a tire along the road froze and stared with wide eyes. Even old Baba Tund, who rarely cared about anything new, lifted his head from his bench and muttered, this town is about to hear a new story." The car finally stopped near the town square not far from the cafe. When the door opened, a tall man stepped out. His shoes shone like glass, his suit looked expensive even to those who had never worn such clothes, and his posture carried the quiet confidence of someone used to important places. His name was Daniel Carter, though the people of the town would only learn that later. Word began to spread faster than harmattan fire in dry grass. "They say the man from that car bought the land near the river. I heard he is from the city, a very rich businessman. Someone said he wants to build a big hotel by the river. A hotel, here in this small town, within an hour." Everyone had heard some version of the story, and each person added a little spice to it. By evening, the news had become the biggest gossip the town had heard in years. And like many strangers before him, Daniel Carter eventually found his way to the small cafe in the center of town. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft ring as he stepped inside. The smell of warm bread and roasted coffee filled the air, and the quiet chatter of customers floated around the room. Lydia was the first to notice him. Her eyes quickly scanned him the way a person looks at something rare. She saw the watch on his wrist, shining softly with quiet elegance. She noticed the way he carried himself, calm and confident, like someone who belonged to bigger cities and brighter lights than this town could offer. Lydia leaned slightly toward the counter and whispered under her breath, This must be the man everyone is talking about. Amara, who was arranging fresh bread on a tray, glanced up for a moment but returned to her work calmly. Lydia quickly wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the table where Daniel had chosen to sit. Her smile was bright and welcoming. "Good afternoon," she said in a cheerful voice. "You must be new here. We don't usually see faces like yours in this town." Daniel smiled politely. "Is that so?" Lydia nodded playfully. "Oh yes, in this town, we know everyone. A stranger is like a drum in the night. Everybody hears it." Daniel chuckled softly at her words. Lydia leaned slightly closer, her voice friendly and warm. "So tell me, what can I get for you?" "The best coffee in town. Or maybe our famous bread. People travel far just to taste it." Before Daniel could answer, Amara appeared beside Lydia carrying a small tray. She placed a cup of coffee gently on the table. "Here," she said softly. "Please try this first. It's fresh from the pot." Daniel looked up at her. For a moment he said nothing. There was something calm and sincere about her presence. Her voice carried no effort to impress, no attempt to charm. It was simple and honest. Lydia noticed the pause and quickly spoke again. "My friend Amara here is the one who bakes the bread. She wakes up before the sun every morning just to make sure this town does not starve." Amara laughed softly. "Don't listen to Lydia too much. She likes to make simple things sound like big stories." Daniel smiled, but his attention remained on Amara. "Simple things are often the best things," he said quietly. Lydia watched carefully as Daniel took a sip of the coffee. She expected him to continue talking with her, but instead he turned toward Amara. "This is very good," he said. "You must take great pride in your work." Amara shrugged lightly. "It is just coffee. When people drink it and smile, that is enough reward." Lydia quickly added, "And if you enjoy it that much, you can leave a generous tip. We won't complain." Daniel laughed and reached into his pocket, placing some money on the table. But before Lydia could move closer, Amara gently pushed the extra money back toward him. "No, sir," she said calmly. "That is too much for a cup of coffee." Daniel looked surprised. "Are you sure?" Amara nodded. "In this town we believe fairness is better than profit." Lydia blinked in disbelief. She forced a smile, but inside her mind she was thinking, who refuses money like that? Daniel studied Amara for a moment, clearly intrigued. "You're different from people I usually meet," he said. Amara simply smiled. "Different how? Most people see a man with money, and they begin to treat him like a king," Daniel replied. "But you treat me like an ordinary traveler." Amara shrugged lightly again. "In this cafe, everyone is just a person who needs food." Lydia laughed loudly, trying to bring the attention back to herself. "Well, if you come often enough, we might start treating you like a king after all." Daniel smiled politely at her joke, but his eyes drifted back to Amara. Something about her quiet warmth seemed to hold his attention in a way he did not expect. That afternoon he stayed longer than he planned, finishing his coffee slowly while listening to the gentle rhythm of the cafe. When he finally stood to leave, he nodded politely to both women. "I think I will return tomorrow," he said. Lydia's smile widened quickly. "You are always welcome here." But it was Amara who simply replied, "Safe journey." The bell above the door rang again as Daniel stepped outside into the warm afternoon. Lydia watched him through the window until the black car disappeared down the road. Then she turned slowly toward Amara. "Did you see that man?" she said in a hushed voice. Amara continued wiping the table. "Yes." Lydia leaned closer, excitement dancing in her eyes. "That man is rich." Everyone in the town is already talking about him. Amara smiled faintly. People talk about many things. Lydia shook her head. No, Amara. This one is different. Amara did not answer. But from that day forward, Daniel Carter began visiting the cafe again and again. At first people said it was because he liked the coffee, but slowly, quietly, something else was drawing him there, something gentle, something sincere, something that smiled softly behind the counter and refused his extra tips, and without anyone realizing it yet. Those small visits would soon begin to change the lives of everyone in that quiet town. After that first day, Daniel Carter began coming to the cafe so often that people in the town started to expect his presence the way they expected the morning sun. Some said he came for the coffee, others said it was the bread, but those who watched closely began to suspect there was another reason. Every morning the bell above the cafe door would ring softly, and there he would be again, stepping inside with that calm city confidence that still looked strange in the quiet town. Amara would greet him the same way she greeted everyone else, with a warm and simple smile. "Good morning," she would say. "Your usual coffee?" Daniel would nod. "Yes, the one that wakes the soul." Amara would laugh softly. "Coffee cannot wake the soul, sir. Only a peaceful heart can do that." Daniel seemed to enjoy those little exchanges more than he enjoyed the drink itself. Soon their conversations began to grow longer. At first they spoke about small things, the weather, the market, the farmers bringing fresh produce into town. But little by little Daniel began asking questions about Amara's life. One afternoon he sat by the window watching the slow movement of people outside while Amara wiped the table nearby. "Tell me something," he said thoughtfully. "Have you always lived in this town?" Amara nodded. "All my life." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Don't you ever feel curious about the world outside this place?" Amara paused for a moment, thinking. "The world outside may be big," she said quietly, "but the heart only needs a small place to feel at home." Daniel looked at her carefully. "That sounds like something an elder would say." Amara smiled. "Maybe the elders are wiser than we think." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head in quiet amusement. There was something about her words that felt peaceful to him, like sitting beside a calm river after a long journey. As the days passed, Daniel began to admire many things about Amara. He admired the way she treated everyone equally, whether they were rich travelers or poor farmers. He admired how she never spoke proudly about herself, even though the entire town respected her. One morning a poor old man entered the cafe with tired eyes and dusty clothes. He searched his pockets nervously before approaching the counter. "My daughter," he said softly to Amara, "I only have enough money for half a loaf of bread." Amara looked at him gently and placed a full loaf in his hands. "Then today you will eat a full loaf," she said kindly. "But I cannot pay," the old man began. Amara shook her head. "When the stomach is full, the heart becomes grateful. That is enough payment." Daniel had been sitting quietly in the corner watching the moment unfold. When the old man left, he walked slowly to the counter. "You gave him twice what he could pay for," he said. Amara shrugged lightly. He looked hungry. Daniel studied her face. "In the city where I come from, people measure everything by money." Amara wiped her hands calmly on her apron. "Money measures things," she replied softly, "but it cannot measure kindness." Those simple words stayed in Daniel's mind long after he left the cafe that day. The more time he spent there, the more he found himself drawn to Amara's quiet spirit. She spoke often about the town, about the river, about how she loved the way people cared for one another. One evening, as the golden light of sunset filled the cafe, Daniel asked her, "If you could have anything in the world, what would it be?" Amara thought for a moment before answering. "I would like the cafe to grow a little bigger so travelers can rest here comfortably. And maybe one day I will build a small house for my mother near the mango trees." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "That is all," Amara nodded with a peaceful smile. "That is enough." Daniel leaned back in his chair, surprised. Most people would wish for riches or big houses. Amara laughed quietly. "Big houses cannot hug you when you are lonely." Daniel could not help but smile at that. But while these quiet conversations were happening between Daniel and Amara, someone else was watching from a distance, Lydia. At first she treated it like a small joke. She would laugh and tease Amara whenever Daniel left the cafe. "Ah, look at our quiet baker," she would say playfully. "The rich city man cannot stop drinking your coffee." Amara would shake her head, slightly embarrassed. "He only likes the cafe." Lydia would grin. "If he liked the cafe so much, he would talk to me too." She laughed loudly as if the whole thing was just harmless fun. But as the days passed, Lydia began noticing something that made her laughter slowly fade. Daniel did not just come for coffee anymore. When he entered the cafe, his eyes searched the room for Amara first. When Amara spoke, he listened carefully as if her words were precious. When she laughed, he smiled in a way Lydia had never seen before. One afternoon Lydia stood near the doorway pretending to sweep the floor while Daniel and Amara talked by the window. She watched Daniel lean closer, clearly interested in every word Amara said. Lydia's broom stopped moving. A strange feeling stirred quietly inside her chest. That evening, after Daniel left, Lydia turned to Amara with a curious smile. "You and that man talk a lot these days," she said. Amara looked slightly confused. "We only talk about ordinary things." Lydia crossed her arms. "Slowly, ordinary things." Her voice carried a tone she herself did not fully understand. That night Lydia lay awake in her bed staring at the ceiling, while the quiet sounds of the town drifted through the window. Something about Daniel's visits was beginning to bother her, though she could not yet explain why. At first she laughed it off, but deep down, a troubling thought had begun to grow like a shadow in her mind. Daniel Carter was not just visiting the cafe anymore. He was slowly, quietly, falling in love with Amara, and Lydia, though she tried not to admit it even to herself, had begun to notice it too. As the days passed and Daniel Carter continued visiting the cafe, Lydia began to notice something she could no longer laugh away. At first she had treated everything like a harmless joke, teasing Amara and smiling whenever Daniel came through the door. But slowly, quietly, Lydia's thoughts began to travel to places she had never allowed them to go before. Whenever she saw Daniel's expensive car parked outside the cafe, her mind began to wander far beyond the dusty roads of the town. She would imagine herself sitting inside that car, the wind blowing softly through the window as it carried her away from the small town she had known all her life. Sometimes, while sweeping the cafe floor, Lydia's thoughts would drift into bright dreams. She would imagine living in a huge mansion in the city, a house so big that the rooms would echo when she walked through them. In her imagination the floors were made of shining marble. The windows were tall like those in palaces, and servants moved quietly through the hallways bringing her food and tea whenever she asked. She imagined opening a large wardrobe filled with beautiful dresses and expensive shoes that sparkled under bright lights. She imagined attending grand parties where rich people laughed and music played through the night. In those dreams she was no longer the girl who served coffee in a small cafe. She was a woman of importance, admired and respected. And in many of those dreams, Daniel Carter stood beside her. One evening, after closing the cafe, Lydia stood outside near the quiet road watching the sunset paint the sky above the river. Amara was beside her folding the cafe chairs. Lydia suddenly spoke in a thoughtful voice. Amara, have you ever imagined what it feels like to travel the world? Amara looked up with curiosity. Travel the world? Lydia nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the fading sun. To see places where the buildings touch the clouds, where lights shine all night, where people live in houses so big they never hear their neighbors. Amara smiled gently. Those places sound beautiful, but they also sound very lonely. Lydia shook her head quickly. Lonely? No, Amara. Those places are full of life, full of opportunity. Amara walked closer to her friend. But Lydia, she said softly, why do you want such a life? Lydia hesitated for a moment before answering. Because I do not want to spend my whole life struggling like our parents did. I want something more. Amara placed a hand gently on Lydia's arm. Wanting more is not wrong, she said kindly. But sometimes the greatest wealth is peace. Lydia forced a smile and nodded. But inside her heart she felt a quiet frustration she could not explain. For many nights after that, Lydia's imagination continued to build pictures of a future far away from the small town. In her mind she saw herself traveling across oceans, walking through beautiful cities, living a life where money was never a problem again. And slowly, without even saying it aloud, Lydia began to believe something deep inside her heart. She began to believe that Daniel Carter was the door that could lead her into that life. She remembered the first moment she saw him step out of the black car. She remembered noticing his expensive watch and confident presence. She had felt something that day, a sudden spark of possibility. In a quiet corner of her heart she had secretly hoped that Daniel would notice her. She had hoped he would admire her beauty, her charm, her lively personality. She had hoped that one day he would look at her the way rich men in stories look at the women they choose to marry. Sometimes she even practiced small conversations in her mind. Daniel, she imagined herself saying with a confident smile, the city must miss you when you stay here too long. And in her imagination Daniel would laugh and reply, maybe the city can wait. I have found something more interesting here. But reality was not the same as her dreams. Each day Daniel returned to the cafe, and each day Lydia noticed the same painful truth. Daniel did not look at her the way she hoped. When he entered the cafe, his eyes searched for Amara first. When Amara spoke, he listened with deep attention. When Amara laughed, his face brightened in a way Lydia had never seen when he spoke to her. Lydia tried to ignore it at first. She told herself she was imagining things. One afternoon she joked about it again while cleaning the counter. Amara, she said with a playful smile, if that man keeps visiting you like this, the town will start planning your wedding before he even asks. Amara laughed shyly and shook her head. You enjoy making stories, Lydia. Lydia laughed too, but the laughter did not reach her heart, because deep inside she was beginning to understand something she did not want to accept. Daniel Carter was not coming to the cafe for her, not for her laughter, not for her beauty, not for her charm. He barely even noticed her, and that realization felt like a small stone dropping into the quiet lake of her heart. At first it caused only a tiny ripple, but day by day the ripple began to grow. Lydia still smiled when Daniel entered the cafe. She still joked and laughed like before. But behind those smiles something else had begun to grow silently inside her chest. It was not loud or obvious. No one in the town could see it. Not even Amara. It was just a small feeling at first, a quiet shadow in her thoughts. A feeling that whispered dangerous questions in the darkness of her mind. Why her and not me? What does she have that I do not? Those questions repeated themselves again and again, like the slow dripping of water inside a cave, and with every passing day the feeling grew a little stronger. The jealousy did not arrive like a storm, it arrived quietly, patiently, like a small crack forming in a strong wall. At first the crack was barely visible, but anyone who understands the nature of cracks knows something important. Once a crack appears, it rarely disappears. Instead, it waits, slowly growing wider with time. And in Lydia's heart, that small crack had already begun to spread. The evening of the town festival arrived like a joyful song carried by the wind. Every year the people of the riverside town gathered near the old bridge to celebrate the season of good harvest and peaceful living. Lanterns hung from tree branches, glowing softly as the sky slowly turned from gold to deep blue. The smell of roasted corn and grilled fish drifted through the air, and the laughter of children ran freely between the stalls and small fires where elders sat, telling stories. Music from drums and flutes filled the night, echoing across the quiet river that flowed gently beneath the old bridge. It was the kind of night when hearts felt light and worries seemed far away. Almara and Lydia arrived together from the cafe, both wearing their best dresses. The town square near the river was already crowded, and many people waved happily when they saw them. Almara, Lydia, called Mama Said, lifting her walking stick with excitement. Come and sit with us. Tonight the town is alive. Lydia smiled brightly and greeted everyone with her usual charm, while Almara moved through the crowd with her calm and gentle warmth. Not far from the river bank stood Daniel Carter, speaking quietly with some of the town elders. He wore a simple shirt that evening, but his presence still carried the quiet confidence everyone had noticed since the day he arrived in town. When Amara saw him, she smiled politely the way she always did. Lydia noticed the way Daniel's eyes immediately softened when they met Amara's gaze. Something inside Lydia tightened for a brief moment, but she quickly pushed the feeling away and forced a cheerful expression. The festival continued with music and dancing. Children ran around with small sparklers, and the younger men competed in playful drum battles while the crowd clapped and laughed. The river reflected the glowing lanterns like tiny stars floating on the water. Then suddenly, the town chief raised his hand for silence. The music faded slowly, and curious whispers moved through the crowd. Why has the chief stopped the music? Someone murmured. The chief cleared his throat and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Tonight we celebrate not only our harvest, but also the friendship that keeps this town strong. The people nodded respectfully, waiting to hear more. Then the chief turned toward Daniel. Our guest from the city has something he wishes to say to all of us. A wave of curiosity passed through the crowd. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his expression calm but serious. For a moment the only sound was the quiet movement of the river behind him. Lydia watched carefully from beside Amara. Her arms folded loosely as she tried to guess what Daniel might say. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. When I first came to this town, he began, his voice steady, I thought I came only to build a hotel and do business. People listened quietly, some nodding. Daniel continued, but sometimes life brings you something you did not plan, something more valuable than money or success. His eyes slowly found Amara in the crowd. Lydia noticed it immediately. Her heart gave a small, uneasy beat. Daniel walked closer, step by step, until he stood directly in front of Amara. The crowd began whispering softly. Sensing something important was about to happen, Amara looked slightly confused but smiled. Politely, "Daniel," she said quietly, "is everything all right?" Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and held something small in his hand. Lydia's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched. The crowd leaned forward with growing curiosity. Then, before anyone could guess what was happening, Daniel slowly lowered himself onto one knee. For a single heartbeat the world seemed to freeze. A sharp gasp spread through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. "Ah!" someone exclaimed. "What is he doing?" Another whispered loudly. Amara's eyes widened in shock. "Daniel, what are you doing?" she asked breathlessly. Daniel looked up at her with sincerity shining clearly in his eyes. "Amara," he said gently, "since the day I entered this town, you have shown me something I had forgotten existed." The crowd stood completely silent now. Even the children stopped running. The only sound was the soft current of the river moving beneath the bridge. Daniel continued, his voice warm and honest. "You showed me kindness when you did not know who I was. You treated me like an ordinary man when others would have treated me like a rich stranger." Amara's hand slowly moved to her mouth as emotion filled her eyes. Daniel opened his hand, revealing a small shining ring that caught the light of the lanterns. "You love this town," he said softly, "and because you love it, I have learned to love it too." The crowd held its breath. Lydia felt her heart begin to pound loudly in her chest. Daniel looked straight into Amara's eyes and spoke the words that would change everything. "Amara, will you marry me?" For a moment there was complete silence, the kind of silence that comes before thunder. Then suddenly the entire crowd gasped together. Ah, the shock lasted only a second before it exploded into loud cheers and excited voices. "She must say yes," someone shouted. "Amara, answer him," cried another. At that exact moment, colorful fireworks burst into the night sky above the river, painting the darkness with bright sparks of red and gold. The reflections danced across the water like falling stars. Amara stood frozen, overwhelmed by everything happening at once. Tears filled her eyes as she looked down at Daniel still kneeling before her. "Daniel, her." Voice trembled with emotion. The crowd waited eagerly, smiling and whispering among themselves. Daniel's voice softened. "Take your time," he said gently. Amara looked around at the faces of the townspeople who had watched her grow up, people who were now cheering and clapping with excitement. Then she looked back at Daniel, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. Slowly, through her tears, a bright smile appeared on her face. She nodded softly. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with joy. "Yes, Daniel, I will marry you." The crowd erupted into loud cheers and celebration. Fireworks continued exploding above the river while people clapped and shouted happily. Some danced. Others hugged each other as if the good news belonged to the entire town. And in the middle of all that joy, Daniel slipped a ring onto Amara's finger while she wiped tears of happiness from her cheeks. But among the smiling faces and bright lights of celebration, one person stood quietly watching. Lydia. Her lips formed a smile like everyone else's, but deep inside her heart something heavy had just fallen like a stone into dark water. And though the festival continued with laughter and fireworks, the small crack that had once formed in Lydia's heart had just grown a little wider. The moment Amara said yes, the quiet river bank exploded with celebration. Cheers rose into the night air like birds suddenly taking flight. And the people of the town rushed forward with joy shining on their faces. Some clapped loudly, others laughed with excitement, and the children jumped around shouting, "Amara is getting married! Amara is getting married!" The fireworks above the river continued bursting into colors of red, gold, and blue, their reflections dancing across the water like bright spirits celebrating in the night. Daniel stood beside Amora, holding her hands gently, while the townspeople gathered around them in a circle of happiness. Mama Said was the first to reach them, pushing through the crowd with her walking stick. "Ah, my daughter," she cried, her old voice full of excitement. She wrapped her arms around Amora in a tight embrace. "Look at you now, from serving bread in the cafe to becoming the bride of a rich man." Amara laughed through her tears, still overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Mama said, "Please, I am still the same Amara." The old woman shook her head firmly. "No, my child, tonight your story has changed." Others stepped forward quickly. Farmers who came to the cafe every morning shook Daniel's hand warmly. Traders congratulated Amara with bright smiles. "You deserve this happiness," one woman said, squeezing Amara's hands. "You have always been good to everyone." Another man laughed and said loudly, "Now our small town will become famous." The rich man and the kind baker. Amara tried to thank everyone, her voice soft and humble as always. "Please, everyone, thank you. You are all like family to me." The crowd continued surrounding her with excitement. Some women examined the shining ring on her finger, gasping with admiration. "Ah, look how it sparkles," one of them whispered. "Daniel truly loves you," another said with a warm smile. Through all the noise and celebration, Lydia stood only a few steps away, watching everything. When the crowd noticed her, someone shouted, "Lydia, come and hug your friend. Your sister is getting married." Lydia quickly stepped forward, her smile wide and bright, the same charming smile everyone in town had known for years. She clapped her hands cheerfully and laughed. "Amara, you kept this secret from me," she said playfully. Amara turned to her with emotional eyes and immediately pulled her into a tight hug. "Lydia," she whispered happily, "can you believe this is really happening?" Lydia wrapped her arms around her friend and laughed softly. "Of course I can believe it," she replied. "You are the luckiest woman in this whole town." The people around them clapped again at the sight of the two best friends embracing. Someone shouted jokingly, "Lydia will soon become the bride's chief bridesmaid." Lydia laughed again and nodded dramatically. "Of course, who else knows Amara's secrets better than me?" The crowd chuckled warmly at her words. Amara pulled back from the hog, her face glowing with happiness. "Lydia, I wish my mother were here tonight to see this," she said quietly. Lydia gently squeezed her hands. "She is seeing it," she replied smoothly. "Wherever she is, she must be smiling." Then Lydia turned toward Daniel and extended her hand politely. "Congratulations," she said with graceful calmness. "You have chosen the most wonderful woman in this town." Daniel smiled warmly as he shook her hand. "Thank you, Lydia. Amara has told me many good things about you." Lydia laughed lightly. "Only the good things, I hope." The celebration continued around them. Music started playing again, and some of the younger villagers began dancing near the river bank. Lanterns glowed softly in the night air, and the smell of roasted food floated through the crowd. Everywhere people were talking about the engagement. "Did you see how he knelt?" someone whispered excitedly. "Like something from a love story," another replied. "Amara has always had a pure heart," an elder said wisely. "Blessings follow those who are kind." Through all of this Lydia continued smiling, clapping, and congratulating her friend like everyone else. She hugged Amara again when another group of women approached, laughing along with their cheerful teasing. To anyone watching, Lydia looked just as happy as the rest of the town. But deep inside her chest, Something very different was happening. Beneath her bright smile, beneath the cheerful laughter she showed the world, Lydia felt a burning heat rising slowly inside her heart. It was quiet at first, like a small flame hidden inside dry grass. She watched Amara as people surrounded her with love and admiration. She watched Daniel stand proudly beside her, holding her hand as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. Lydia clapped again as someone shouted, "3 cheers for the bride," but inside her mind, a single thought had begun repeating itself over and over like the steady beating of a drum. That life should have been mine. She watched the shining ring on Amara's finger. That life should have been mine. She watched the rich man smiling beside her friend. That life should have been mine. She watched the town celebrating the girl who once stood beside her serving coffee behind the same small counter. And while everyone else saw only joy and friendship, Lydia stood there smiling with the crowd, hiding the quiet fire growing in her heart as the same thought echoed again and again in the silence of her mind. That life should have been mine. Over the weeks that followed the festival, the quiet town began to change in small but noticeable ways. Everywhere people talked about the coming wedding. Women gathered in the market discussing fabrics and decorations. The elders spoke about proper ceremonies and blessings. Even the children had begun singing playful songs about Amara becoming the bride of the rich city man. Life in the cafe also began to change. Daniel visited more often, not as a curious guest anymore, but as a man whose heart had found a home. Sometimes he arrived carrying small boxes wrapped neatly with ribbons. One morning he placed one gently on the counter and said, "Amara, I saw this in the city and thought of you." Amara opened it slowly and gasped softly. Inside was a beautiful dress, soft and elegant, unlike anything she had ever owned before. "Daniel, this is too much," she said quietly. Daniel smiled warmly. "Nothing is too much for the woman I love." Lydia stood nearby polishing a cup, her smile still present but thinner than before. The town people admired the gifts Daniel brought: new shoes, fine fabrics, jewelry that sparkled under the cafe lights, and slowly the conversations began to include something else: the city. One evening Daniel said gently, after the wedding, "We could move to the city for some time. I want to show you the world." Amara looked uncertain but curious. "The city is very big." She replied softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, but I will be beside you." Lydia heard every word while ranging chairs behind them. She said nothing. She only listened. Each passing day seemed to lift Amara higher into a life Lydia had always dreamed about. People now spoke to Amara with admiration. They called her the lucky bride. They congratulated her wherever she went. Meanwhile, Lydia remained the same girl serving coffee in the same small cafe. At night she often sat quietly staring out the window while the town slept. The more Amara's life improved, the more Lydia felt something inside her sinking like a stone in deep water. Then one evening something happened that pushed Lydia's heart into a darker place. The cafe was nearly empty. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange above the river. Daniel stood near the doorway speaking softly to Amara. Lydia was in the back room, but their voices drifted clearly through the open window. Daniel took Amara's hands gently and said words that pierced the quiet air. "You deserve the world, Amara. I want to give you everything." Lydia froze where she stood. Those words struck her heart like a sharp blade. She remained silent, but something inside her twisted painfully. That night Lydia returned home but could not sleep. She lay in bed staring into the darkness while her thoughts moved like restless spirits. Again and again she heard Daniel's voice in her mind. You deserve the world. I want to give you everything." Lydia turned on her side and whispered bitterly into the empty room, "That world was supposed to be mine." As the night grew deeper, her thoughts began to change shape. The jealousy that had once been a quiet whisper began growing heavier and darker. A dangerous idea slowly formed inside her mind, creeping in like a shadow through an open door. She tried to push it away at first, but the thought returned again and again. If Amara disappears, everything could change. A few days later, Lydia approached Amara with a soft smile that hid the storm inside her heart. "Amara," she said gently, "do you remember how we used to walk by the bridge at night when we were younger?" Amara laughed warmly. "Of course I remember. We used to talk for hours." Lydia nodded slowly. "Let's do that again tonight." Just like old times, Amara agreed without hesitation. After all, Lydia was not just a friend. She was the sister she had chosen. That evening the town was quiet. A soft breeze moved across the river, and the streetlights along the old bridge flickered gently. The two women walked side by side the way they had done since childhood. They laughed softly as they remembered small stories from the past. "Do you remember when we tried to fish with our hands and fell into the mud?" Lydia asked with a small laugh. Amara giggled. "And Mama Said scolded us for dirtying our clothes." They both laughed again, their voices echoing softly over the water. After a while they stopped near the middle of the bridge, leaning against the railing and looking down at the dark river moving quietly beneath them. Amara sighed peacefully. "Lydia, thank you," she said softly. Lydia turned slightly. "For what?" "For always standing by me," Amara replied warmly. "You have supported me since we were children. I don't know what I would do without you." Those kind words, meant with love, only made Lydia's chest tighten. Her smile slowly faded as her mind began racing. Her breathing became heavier. The dark water below seemed to whisper something only she could hear. Amara turned her head slightly, gazing at the reflection of the streetlights in the river, and in that single moment, Lydia's heart made its terrible decision. Her hands moved before her thoughts could stop them. Suddenly, she pushed Amara. Amara's scream shattered the quiet night as her body slipped over the railing. "Lydia!" Splash! The sound echoed across the dark river. Then everything became silent again. Lydia stood frozen, staring down into the water. The river moved slowly, hiding its secrets beneath the dark surface. No movement, no sound. Lydia's chest rose and fell as she struggled to breathe. Finally she whispered to herself in a trembling voice, "It's over." She looked around the empty bridge one last time. Then she turned and walked slowly back toward the sleeping town, believing no one had seen what she had done. But the river, like all rivers, sometimes keeps secrets only for a while. The days after the engagement passed peacefully in the town, but deep inside Lydia's heart the quiet storm continued to grow. She still smiled when people spoke about the wedding. She still laughed when the women teased Amara about becoming the rich man's bride. But the more the town celebrated Amara's happiness, the more Lydia felt something dark tightening on her heart like a rope slowly being pulled. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills and the soft, orange light touched the rooftops of the small town, Lydia stood outside the cafe watching the river in the distance. The water moved slowly beneath the old bridge, calm and silent like it had been for generations. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned toward Amara, who was wiping the last table before closing the cafe. Lydia forced a gentle smile and spoke in a soft voice. "Amara," she said, "do you remember the nights we used to walk by the bridge when we were younger?" Amara looked up and smiled immediately, her eyes bright with memory. Of course I remember, she said warmly. We used to sit there for hours talking about everything. Lydia nodded slowly. Yes, about dreams, about life, about the future. Amara laughed lightly. Back then our biggest worry was whether Mama Said would catch us staying out too late. Lydia chuckled softly, though her laughter felt heavy inside her chest. After a moment she said gently, "Let's go there tonight. Just the two of us, like old times." Amara's face lit up with happiness. "That would be wonderful," she replied quickly. "It has been so long since we had time to talk like that." Lydia nodded, her smile calm and warm on the outside. "Yes," she said quietly, "it has been too long." Later that evening the town grew quiet as night slowly covered the sky. The small houses glowed softly under their lanterns, and the cool wind from the river carried the smell of wet earth and distant trees. Lydia and Amara walked side by side along the familiar road that led toward the old bridge. Their footsteps echoed gently on the path, just like they had many years ago when they were young girls with simple dreams and carefree hearts. Amara looked around happily as they approached the river. "Nothing here ever changes," she said with a peaceful smile. "The same trees, the same road, the same bridge." Lydia looked toward the dark shape of the bridge ahead of them. "Some things never change," she murmured softly, "but people do." Amara glanced at her friend curiously. "What do you mean?" Lydia quickly shook her head with a small laugh. "Nothing serious. I was only thinking about how much our lives have changed." They stepped onto the old bridge, where tall streetlights flickered gently in the quiet night. The river below moved slowly in the darkness, deep and silent, reflecting faint pieces of light from the lamps above. The cool breeze brushed softly against their faces as they leaned against the railing together. For a while they simply watched the water flowing beneath them. Then Amara began laughing softly as memories returned. "Do you remember when we tried to skip stones here, and you threw yours into the water by accident?" she asked playfully. Lydia smiled faintly. "And you laughed at me for almost an hour, because you were angry at the stone," Amara teased. "You said the river cheated you." Lydia chuckled quietly. "Maybe it did." They continued talking about small childhood moments, the days they ran through the town barefoot, the nights they shared secrets under the stars, the times they promised to always remain together no matter what life brought. The bridge had always been a place where their friendship felt strongest. After a while Amara grew quiet and looked out across the dark water. Her voice softened as she spoke. "Lydia," she said gently, "I want to thank you." Lydia turned her head slightly. "For what?" Amara smiled warmly at her. "For always being beside me," she said, "through everything." "Since we were little girls." Lydia said nothing. Amara continued, speaking with honest emotion. "You supported me when life was hard. You stood with me when we struggled to keep the cafe open. And now, even when everything is changing, you are still here." Lydia stared down at the dark river below. Amara placed a hand gently on Lydia's arm. "I am lucky to have a friend like you," she said softly. Those simple words, spoken with pure love, struck Lydia's heart like a heavy stone. Instead of comfort, they filled her chest with a burning heat she could no longer control. Inside her mind, the thoughts she had tried to bury began screaming louder than ever. She felt her breathing grow heavier. Her fingers slowly tightened against the cold metal railing. Amara turned back toward the water, unaware of the storm rising beside her. "Sometimes I wonder what my life will look like in a year," she said dreamily. "Maybe the city will feel strange at first, but Daniel says we will visit the town often. Lydia's chest rose and fell faster now. The quiet voice in her mind returned with cruel clarity. That life should have been mine. The river below moved slowly, dark and endless. Almara leaned slightly over the railing, watching the faint reflection of the streetlights shimmering across the water. "No matter where life takes me," she said gently, "you will always be my sister." Lydia's mind raced wildly now. Her heart pounded loudly in her ears. The jealousy she had carried for weeks had finally reached its breaking point. Her hands trembled as she stared at Amara's back. For a single moment, time seemed to slow. Then suddenly, Lydia pushed her. Amara's body lurched forward over the railing before she even understood what was happening. Her terrified scream tore through the quiet night. "Lydia!" The sound echoed across the empty river as her body fell into the darkness below. Then came the splash. The water swallowed the sound quickly, and the ripples spread across the black surface of the river. After that, there was only silence. Lydia stood frozen beside the railing, staring down into the dark water. The river continued flowing quietly as if nothing had happened. The night wind moved softly through the trees. No voices. No footsteps. Just the silent river carrying its secret into the darkness. For a long moment Lydia stood frozen on the bridge, her hands still gripping the cold metal railing. Her eyes stared into the dark river below as the water moved slowly, swallowing the ripples that had spread when Amara's body struck the surface. The night was silent again, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Lydia leaned slightly forward, searching the black water. She waited. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest. But there was no movement, no hand reaching up. The bridge was empty. The streetlights flickered above her, casting weak yellow circles onto the road. No footsteps approached, no voices called out. The town beyond the bridge slept peacefully, unaware that something terrible had just happened beside their silent river. Lydia looked down one last time into the darkness. Her lips trembled slightly as she whispered to herself, almost like someone trying to convince their own heart, "It's over." The words floated softly into the night air before disappearing into the silence. She released the railing slowly and stepped back. For a moment she stood there alone on the bridge, her face pale under the streetlight. Then she turned and began walking toward the town. Her steps were calm and steady, the way someone walks after finishing a simple evening stroll. The quiet road stretched ahead of her, leading back toward the houses and narrow streets where people were already asleep in their beds. Lydia did not look back again. In her mind she believed the dark river had taken Almara far away, hiding the truth beneath its deep water. A few minutes later Lydia arrived, carrying her usual small bag. When she saw Daniel standing there, she widened her eyes with concern. "Daniel," she asked softly, "what is wrong?" Daniel turned quickly. "Have you seen Almara this morning?" Lydia shook her head slowly. "No, I thought she would already be here." Daniel's worry deepened. She covered her ears, but the sound would not disappear, and for the first time since that terrible moment on the bridge, Lydia began to feel something she had not expected: guilt. Quiet at first, but growing stronger with every passing hour. The morning sun rose gently over the quiet town, but the peace it brought could not calm the growing fear in the hearts of the people. By now everyone knew that Amara was missing. Daniel Carter had barely slept through the night. His eyes were red and tired as he moved through the streets again and again, calling her name with a voice that grew more desperate each hour. Amara, Amara, he shouted, knocking on doors and asking every person he met, "Have you seen her?" The townspeople quickly joined the search. Farmers left their fields. Traders closed their small stalls. Even the school children were sent home early as the adults walked through every road and path calling Amara's name. Lydia moved among them like a worried sister. Her face showed the same sadness everyone else carried. "She must be somewhere," she told the women who searched beside her. Amara would never disappear like this. But deep inside her chest, the memory of the night before remained heavy and silent like a hidden stone. By afternoon the search moved closer to the river. The old bridge stood quietly under the bright daylight, as if it knew nothing about the terrible secret it had witnessed. Then suddenly a young boy shouted from the side of the bridge, "Wait, look here." People rushed toward him. In his hand was a piece of cloth caught between two wooden posts. Mama Sade stepped closer, her hands trembling. That is Amara's scarf." A deep silence fell over the group. Slowly the people turned their eyes toward the dark water flowing beneath the bridge. One of the elders spoke softly. "Perhaps she slipped during the night." Another man nodded sadly. "Yes. The river has taken people before." Daniel stared down into the moving water, his voice shaking. No, Amara would not fall so easily, but the river looked deep and dangerous, and the scarf seemed to tell its own story. Soon the town accepted the painful explanation. Amara must have leaned too far over the railing during her evening walk and slipped into the dark current. It was a tragic accident. Lydia stood among the mourners. Her head bowed as tears rolled gently down her cheeks. She hugged the women who cried beside her and comforted Daniel when he could barely stand from grief. To everyone watching, Lydia looked like the most heartbroken of them all. Yet inside her mind something had begun to whisper in the quiet moments of the night: guilt. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the same terrible image the moment Amara's body disappeared over the railing, the frightened scream, the splash that followed. Lydia tried to tell herself the same words again and again. "It's over. No one knows," but the memory refused to disappear. What Lydia did not know was that the river had not been the only witness that night. Beneath the bridge, far below the road, an old fisherman had been checking his nets by lantern light. When Amara's scream echoed through the darkness, the old man looked up suddenly. He had seen a shadow at the railing and a body falling into the water. Startled and confused, he rushed toward the river bank with his lantern shaking in his hand, but by the time he reached the water, the current had already carried Amara away into the darkness. The fisherman stood there for a long time, staring into the river, unsure of what he had truly seen. Was it an accident? Had someone pushed her? In the darkness and confusion he could not be certain, so he kept the troubling memory to himself. Weeks passed. The town slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, though a heavy sadness remained in many hearts. Daniel became silent and distant, often sitting alone by the river as if hoping Amara might somehow return. Then far downstream, in another small fishing town many miles away, something unexpected happened. Early one morning a group of fishermen noticed something caught along the reeds near the river bank. At first they thought it was only floating debris carried by the current. But as they pulled their boat closer, one of the men suddenly gasped, "Wait, someone is there." They quickly dragged the weak body from the water. The young woman was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and her skin pale from days of struggle. She was injured and exhausted, but still alive. The fishermen carried her carefully to shore. When she finally opened her eyes, her voice was only a faint whisper. "My name is Amara." Months later, the people of the town gathered once again near the old bridge. This time the mood was heavy and quiet. The elders had decided to hold a memorial for Amara. A small ceremony to honor the kind young woman the town believed the river had taken forever. Lanterns were placed along the bridge, and many people stood silently holding flowers. Daniel stood near the railing staring into the water, his face filled with grief that had not faded with time. Lydia stood nearby among the townspeople. She wore black and kept her head lowered like someone mourning deeply. But inside her heart she carried a secret she believed would remain buried forever beneath the river's dark current. The chief of the town began speaking slowly. "Today we remember a daughter of this town, a woman known for kindness and humility." The people bowed their heads respectfully. Then suddenly the sound of an approaching engine broke the quiet moment. Everyone turned toward the road. A car slowly pulled to a stop near the bridge. The door opened. For a moment no one moved. Then a thin woman stepped out carefully, supported by two men beside her. She looked weak, her body still recovering, but her face was unmistakable. Someone gasped loudly, That is impossible." Daniel's eyes widened as if he had seen a ghost. The woman took a few slow steps forward. "Amara," Daniel whispered in disbelief. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs. The woman standing before them was indeed Amara alive. Tears filled Daniel's eyes as he rushed forward to hold her carefully. The town stood frozen in shock and joy. But across the bridge Lydia felt something very different. The moment she saw Amara step from that car, her entire body went cold. Terror gripped her heart like an iron hand. Because if Amara had survived, then the truth might still be alive too. And that terrible truth did not take long to rise to the surface. Slowly, with the quiet strength of someone who had fought death and returned, Amara told her story. She spoke of the night walk with Lydia, the conversation on the bridge, the moment she felt hands pushing her into the darkness. "I remember falling," she said softly, "and the last face I saw was Lydia's." The crowd turned slowly toward Lydia. At that moment the old fisherman stepped forward from the back of the gathering. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I was beneath the bridge that night," he said. "I saw a shadow, and someone falling." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to break the air itself. All eyes fixed on Lydia. Her secret, the one she believed the river had buried forever, now stood exposed before the entire town. And the friend she had betrayed had lived to tell the truth.